Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the role of Compassionate Judaism, Dr. Gopin's assistance to the Syrian refugees, and the importance of conflict resolution. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Dr. Marc Gopin, professor at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. Thank you so much, Marc, for joining us after 5 years of our first interview.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's hard to believe it was 5 years.
I know. And I mean, I kind of want to go back because it's been 5 years, just to talk about your background and your work. You've lived in Syria for a while. You've experienced the life in Syria before the revolution started. You've appeared on the Syrian television. You've had a long journey, and I'm going to talk about why is it so special that you did have that in a moment, but can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, those experiences began in about 2003, and I came as a guest, like a guest of honor. At the time, what we were hoping to do was something along the lines of interfaith diplomacy. We knew that Syria was a very serious police state and things were very closed down. But we wanted to open up to the possibility of relationships between different religions and different peoples and some shared values. And so I began to go on a regular basis. And the first time I went was a very big event. And so I spoke at the Assad Library, which is the central library of Damascus, central meeting place in Damascus. And it was a lot of dignitaries were there, a lot of ambassadors, and then they had dinners for me every night at different houses with all these ambassadors coming. And it was an extraordinary experience. But for me, that was the beginning of the work, not the end of the work, because our hope was that over time we would establish enough of a rapport between different kinds of Syrians and myself from my background and start to see something in common between very religious, very secular, Sunni, Shia, Alawite, and we made some very Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, Christian, and we had these amazing events where people, and eventually we had students studying conflict resolution through a lot of efforts over years that we had hundreds of students in the end. And so that was our effort to try and hold Syria together and also to try and prevent others from tearing it apart. And unfortunately, it was a small effort, but it was a good effort. It was very, very few people had managed with my background, and because we didn't accept any money, it was all volunteer, we managed to start finding an educational way and an interpersonal, interfaith way to build some deep relationships.
What about the Assad regime in this? Do you think the Assad regime is part of why we are where we are today?
Well, I think it's at the core of why we are where we are today. And I think it's very unfortunate because I think many, many people, I'd say thousands and thousands of people, both in Syria and outside, wanted him to have the chance to slowly open up Syria. And their main complaints were about corruption. They were not about his leadership per se. And unfortunately, there were various forces at work that made the corruption even worse as time went on. There was a drought, and then there were the wars. And in those wars, there was a cynical use of terrorists and others that got him into trouble with neighbors, that started with threats and counter-threats, and eventually this really bad blood with the Saudis and others. And no one could keep this all together, because there was some really, really bad diplomatic skills at the highest levels. We tried to steer clear of that and mainly focus on people-to-people skills and capacities.
Again, so, which years were you there?
From 2003 to 2011. The last time we were there, we actually even ended up in the palace in a 2-hour meeting with Mrs. Assad on conflict resolution. With his wife.
Yes, and that was right before the revolution.
Right before.
Right before.
It was just beginning.
But here you are, I mean, a Jewish rabbi in Syria, where the Assad regime has the big slogan of being the resistance to Israel, and obviously, there's a systematic fuel of hatred against the Jewish people. How, on a personal level, in your own experience, what type of problems did you run into? I'm sure there was plenty.
Well, honestly, I think the friends and associates I was working with tried to shield me from any of those problems. There were, I was treated with great respect by most people. I never had any kind of open assaults on me because I was Jewish. There were restrictions, however. It was almost impossible for me to visit the synagogue, even though I wanted to. It was.
And why is that? What's the reason they gave you?
There was no official reason. It was just very difficult to get there because you had to get permission before you went. And I could cause trouble to the few Jews that were left that were going to synagogue, and I could cause trouble to my hosts. Because as it is, I mean, it was never logical, but I knew that Israel and Syria were arch enemies. I knew that the wound of what Eli Cohen had done in terms of spying had had severe consequences in the '67 war. But it wasn't very rational to assume that because he happened to be an Israeli spy, that an Israeli spy was going to go to synagogue and do all these things. It just wasn't logical. It was more punitive.
And you're saying who you were. You're not hiding your identity.
Exactly. And so...
So you didn't get to meet any Jews in Syria?
No, I made a strategic decision to focus on peace and coexistence, which I hope would benefit everybody, including relations between the countries the countries in the region, and not to meet 10 Jews that I might meet. I made a decision that it was more important for the sake of
the bigger purpose.
The bigger purpose, which was to diffuse by example that there doesn't have to be a permanent state of war between the Jewish people in Syria, for example, or between the Arab world and the Jewish world. And the example that I was setting was enough for me. But the trouble I could get people into with the secret police by going and visiting them was not fair to them, and it wasn't going to accomplish nearly as much as, say, a speech in the Assad Library, or 100 students in conflict resolution studying interfaith relations and tolerance, including many Alawite students. And it was a big thing in my life to be able to reach out to the Alawite minority who nobody was allowed to talk about, precisely because I understood from history what it is to be a minority that has been persecuted and that has an adversarial relationship with everyone else. And I wanted to bridge that gap between Sunni, Alawite, Shia, and obviously me as a Jew. And we did. I mean, we had wonderful classes where we had so many people, even people in the government, studied with us. And we were trying to set a new way of thinking, because conflict resolution is very much about focusing on the imagination and the future rather than anger at the past. It's about examining what your role is in every conversation, where things go right, where they go wrong, studying yourself, as it were, a focus on positive pro-social emotions. There's a lot of steps that I write about in my books.
And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, too.
And I wanted to convey that in Syria. And ever since then, and also with the refugees, that training has gone very, very well.
Yes, and that's also another thing that I recently learned about, that since we've met last time, even though we're friends on Facebook, you're still helping Syrian refugees. I mean, I've had you on 5 years ago or more. You were already working to help Syrian refugees and Syrians who fled Syria because of the killing that was going on from the Assad regime side. I learned recently that you continued since then to work on this issue, and you haven't been talking a lot about it. You haven't been posting about it. I didn't know. But you continued to work, even though there's a lot of other people who packed up and left because they felt that it was like just a non-ending conflict.
It's not only part of my work. It's been the most time-consuming work I've done in the past 5 years. And I do everything quietly because the quieter you are, the more you can accomplish. And I also wanted to find a way to do it without big funds. So we ended up doing it through classes, through basically bringing my university and my students and students from several universities into a relationship with the refugees, with survivors, with the children, with traumatized children. And then eventually we continued to find ways to empower who we could, who were interested in real social change on a democratic level. And that turned out to be especially women, because the men were so busy killing each other and fighting each other. And women in many parts of the world turn out to be the quiet revolutionaries of social change in a more human rights and democratic direction. And they also care for the children the most. So we found, so basically we were in triage at the beginning, trying to help survivors with massive trauma, and worked in Turkey on the border, in Rahanya and other places, right on the border.
Yes.
And then the first refugee camps that we went into were just, it was just horrible to see seas of children unsupervised, and most of the men missing, and everybody in sorrow, and the Turkish soldiers not speaking a word of English with all the guns and everything. And the Turks basically did wonderful work, but they also were afraid. I mean, this was a very volatile situation, and
especially in the beginning, it was all new. They didn't know what to expect, what to do.
yeah, and then there were also a lot of extremists around trying to make it very
Yes.
dangerous in Gaziantep and other places. So.
How did you find yourself in that position? Because, I mean, you're not only American, you're an American rabbi.
Right, so I just went quietly,
And
I stayed in my hotel, and I wasn't much of a target as much. Frankly, Syrians were targets.
yes,
You know, Syrians from the Syrian Free Army, Democrats, anybody who was a Democrat, their life was in danger, because the Middle East still cannot support Arab Democrats. It is a tragedy that, except for Tunisia and some political parties in Jordan and other places, it is very, very hard to survive physically
yes,
as a Democrat. And so, again, whatever quiet way we could find to support those people, particularly women who were not paid as much attention to, and start training in the skills of organization, survival, helping the women overcome efforts by extremists to capture them for whatever. The girls, sewing, I mean, computers, we did everything that we could with very little funds and just moral support wherever we could. And we started in Turkey.
yes.
And then one of my students started creating schools, transitional schools for Syrian kids. And so to this day, those are the schools that we go to twice a year.
Yes.
We invest in them. And then we also found this amazing trauma center in Amman for kids that is just brilliant advanced work. It's all Syrian. So I prefer, when you do serious work, you want to focus on the talents of the people themselves. That's real development. That's real empowerment work. So it continues.
You continue.
Yeah.
So do you have work with the Syrian partners on those things?
Everyone is Syrian. And
Except
then
for
we
you.
have good relations with Jordanians, you know, when we go, or in Turkey, but everyone is Syrian that we're working directly with.
And how was your personal experience, you know, for them knowing that you are a Jewish rabbi doing this? What was it to you? I mean, do you have any memorable reaction that you received from some people?
Well, it's been an emotional roller coaster to deal with. It's one of the biggest tragedies in modern history, with 500,000 dead and tens and thousands tortured.
Numbers are probably higher, but that's what the United Nations says. Yeah.
But we're just there. People are just grateful. I don't talk much about my own religion, because for me, my spiritual journey is different. I don't need to promote my own spirituality and my own ethics. I'm there for a very particular set of ethical ideals and spiritual ideals, but I keep that religious ritual quiet, partially because there are extremists around,
Yes.
and partially because some of the regimes would use that as an excuse to besmirch what is happening. And then occasionally, when we feel it's safe, we talk to people about the interfaith aspect. There was a priest in Turkey that I remember we eventually he lost his library, and he was a wonderful Christian priest. And once in a while I open up and they're very grateful, and it's very warm when I can meet fellow clerics.
Yes.
There was also a wonderful sheikh in Shia, I won't mention his name, who we had a very brotherly relationship with when I was still going to Damascus. So clerics who are open to this are very, very good and warm, and they don't have any conspiracy theories or rumors, but I've never been treated badly in all of this time. So.
So there it is. I mean, I just kind of like want to, it's a very complicated situation that I kind of want to explain to the audience a little bit more. Because the Assad regime, kind of waves the flag of resistance to Israel. Basically, there's a lot of history of abusing the Jewish people in Syria, systematically kicking them out of Syria by the same regime, by the same Ba'ath party. And then they allowed you to come. And how did they play this? I mean, how could they be doing, kind of showing that facade? And obviously now we know that they're trying to say we are no longer trying to resist anybody. So they're trying to portray a different face now, a different facade. How do you think they tried? Yes, what was the line?
Their public line was that we are the space of interfaith tolerance. We are the one place in the Middle East and where we resist extremism, by which they meant generally Islamic extremism. And so you have to take it at face value. A lot of people who ended up siding with the regime and were always pro-regime, some of them are Sunni, some are Shia, some are a lot of Christians. They felt that the extremism sweeping the Middle East would destroy the kind of life they had of greater tolerance inside Syria. And so they were willing to look away from all of the massive crimes that were being committed by the forces.
And obviously the fueling of extremism that the Assad regime systematically have done.
They also,
since the Iraq War and before.
Yeah, they hired and paid and put out of prison. They let them out of prison.
Yes.
Exactly, to make it all worse. I mean, yeah, it's cynical and it's horrible. And when you start to see the alliances in the Middle East between supposedly very religious and supposedly very secular, they both hire the same extremists.
Yes.
For whatever purposes they need, which are basically criminal. And then there's the people in the middle. So in the middle of all of that, all I could do was focus on values, on shared values, and to try and represent something that was different, that went across religious lines, that went across religious secular lines, and to focus on skills. And when you focus on skills and you focus on a certain kind of social science, it actually appeals to people in all sectors. And I tried to not be as political about those conclusions. The reason why I stopped going to Damascus was because I just couldn't be associated anymore, or even give public relations benefits to a regime that had made these terrible decisions ever since they shot those kids in Dara. They went down a path that was a terrible path towards genocide and war crimes.
And that was it for you.
And then I couldn't, even though there were many students there who would have loved for me to come. And that's wrenching, because people end up on two sides of a war.
Yes. So you feel for the people who are stuck in that position still in Syria today, but
I do.
You just couldn't associate yourself with this regime anymore.
Most people don't commit these acts, but they end up justifying them in order to save themselves or in order to save something. And I still think that someday the search for common values and shared skills, shared ethics, is the only thing that's going to bind together religious and secular in a move towards democracy.
You were just in Jordan now. I mean, this is how recent we're talking about. I was waiting for you to do this interview because you were in Jordan.
I go twice a year, and I bring a class with me. That class is also a way to educate Americans on what the real situation is. And it's also a service trip. So they're studying, they're writing graduate papers for me from different universities, and then they work with the kids. It's a transformative experience for them because I have secondary goals. And those secondary goals is that I want people who are engaged in policy formation in the United States and elsewhere to study the consequences of their policies. So that means military people come, people working for contractors. Their lives are changed when they work with these kids. They see the reality of what war does, and it changes them. So I have another goal here, and that is to get people to be more and more sober about war. Because most people who get sober about war in the American military are seasoned generals and people who have been around for a long time, and they start to learn, and they're much more cautious about loss of life, honestly, and I've worked with many people. But at the policy level, at the political level, a lot of people have no concept of what's really happening. And Americans in particular simply divided along left and right lines and didn't have a clue about what was actually happening to Syrians. Everything becomes very tribal. So I wanted to undo that completely, demystify very religious Muslims they'd work with, demystify Arabs, demystify the tragedy of war and civil war, and get them into the subtle place of what it is to make a positive change in the middle of that insanity.
Exactly.
Which is to love children, is to empower women, skills of governance, skills of communications, skills of coexistence. You know.
You're also a professor at George Mason, and you teach classes to promote these changes in people. Tell me a little bit more.
So the work so I've written a number of books over the years, and I'm a professor of conflict analysis and resolution, which is a hybrid field of international relations, political science, psychology, and anthropology. My big contribution has been an understanding of world religions. That's what my degree is, and I also have a degree in philosophy. And so we combine this in order to find effective ways to end conflicts or prevent them from breaking out, and we wanted that to be based on field work, based on understanding situations in all of their complexity on the ground. In recent times, especially since this catastrophe in Israel-Palestine and also in Syria, I've become much more fascinated by brain science, neuroscience, something called neuroplasticity, and the ways in which people evolve away from hatred and towards compassion and the higher use of reason. And what are the skills that bring us into that? So basically all the training that I do is designed to move people towards habits of the mind that move away from violence and move away from conspiracy theories, towards problem solving, but also towards compassion. And compassion is a positive way in which you identify with the life of another.
So in your research, you've been connecting between having basically some brain imbalance, chemical imbalance in the brain, and with like hatred, racism, and all of these other negative. Tell me a little bit more about this.
So whether it be racism or hatred or just a fight that people have in a family, the moment you get into fighting, people go to their amygdala, which is their lower brain, or some call it the reptilian brain, but it's a part of the brain in the brain stem that's very focused on fear, loathing, hatred, and a shutting down and a weakening of the anatomy of the higher brain, which is involved in both the higher use of reason and compassion. And compassion and reason give you a capacity to be in a nonviolent relationship with other people and to figure out ways and rules that basically apply to all people. So basically universal rules come out of that cultivation of the higher thinking. So believe it or not, even in the midst of war and conflict and concern, and even in the police state that I used to work in, there are people who had practiced that and who were visionary. And then there were people who were not and were constantly in fear and in distrust. Most normal people are somewhere in between because these situations are difficult. training is about moving the mind in that direction. Now, it's complicated in war because there's another thing called empathy. And empathy makes you, actually depresses you. It raises your blood pressure. It's painful. It's not healthy, actually. Whereas compassion as a training moves you towards love and care for the other, which actually is quite nurturing. It lowers the blood pressure. It increases the brain capacity in its problem-solving abilities. So part of the training now, I'm moving people towards yoga and meditation and imaginings that focus on compassion and compassionate practices, so that they take the pain they're feeling at seeing suffering and move it in a more positive direction.
Yes.
And I as I worked with many, many Syrians, I said, I saw they needed this badly because they were so surrounded by so much painful experience, and they needed a positive way to move their minds and a way to cope with reality and flourish and even recover.
But that's very interesting, the distinguishing between empathy and compassion, because as you said, one would make you feel for others, but in a very negative, hopeless way. The other one is more like you put it into practice and try to do something about it. Is that how do you...
It's a difference between watching the news and seeing everybody blown up and wanting to just go to sleep, and playing with a kid. So you play with the kid and you know the kid has been through war and it hurts. But as you play with them, you're focused on a certain kind of brain activity that is very healthy and very sustainable and very addictive in a positive sense. Whereas when you just look at pain on the television, it's addictive in a negative sense. It gets you addicted to trauma, to depression. And that has led to apathy, cynicism, giving up, which is what a lot of dictators like. I mean, a lot of people...
Or anger, wanting to revenge. I mean, all of the other negative aspects that you
all
become
of those
radical
things,
or...
Exactly.
Yes.
They're great for terrorist groups. They're great for dictatorships. They're not good for democracy. For democracy, you need a sustainable mind and heart that are committed to positive thinking and positive activities. And so helping people train in that direction, whether it be my students coming from the West or whether it be the people we're working with, that's been the key goal, is that joy. And there's good neuroscience, a cutting-edge neuroscience that Europeans and others are discovering on the difference between compassion and empathy, and that we really need to move people in that positive direction. So, yeah.
Well, that's, it's just very interesting to hear, and I think it's great. But I do want to come back to the fact that you are a rabbi, and you are an Orthodox rabbi. I just learned this recently, and please bear with me. I want our audience also to understand, because of obviously, we know that there's different denominations within Judaism, and when you say Orthodox, people would think of somebody more, religious, stuck into certain ways, maybe more closed off from others.
Right.
Please tell us the truth about this. I mean, how and how are you also perceived by other Orthodox, practicing Orthodox or other rabbis?
So most religions have a conservative wing, and that conservative wing has two different features to it. One is a life of piety, which means a lot of personal practices and a lot of personal study. The other one is often associated with a kind of tribalism. So you'll see on the right wings of most of the religions of the world that people on that right wing only care about their group, or only care about their group that's saved. They don't even like the rest of the people in their group. And there's all these extremists within Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism even, that their life is about fighting the others, right? So that's one expression of conservatism. But another expression of it is personal piety. And I came out of an Orthodox environment where I was specifically trained by people who combined very rigorous legal traditional lifestyle together with very universal Kantian European ideals. And that was the rabbis that I studied with and that I grew up with. And so I adopted that, and I took it much, much further than the people in my community towards a foray into the world of enemies, the world of people who many of them had officially not liked me or even persecuted my community, and I wanted to experiment and see what was this going to look like. So it's been an odd combination that for me is a natural in terms of my spirituality, which is I keep the Sabbath wherever I go. I don't drive in car. You know, really extreme stuff for a lot of people. I don't drive in cars on, I don't drive a car or cook on a Saturday, Friday night to Saturday night. I've never broken that in all the years that I was working in Syria. I never eat, I only eat kosher food, and I kept all the Jewish holidays in, you know, strictly. But I find the legal ways to be able to manage in situations to make priorities so that saving lives is one of the highest priorities in Jewish law. So when I was dealing with the tragedies in Syria or in other places, the acts I was doing to stop conflict or to put two people together superseded some of the rituals, not all of the rituals, but some of the ones that were not as important or is not as high a priority. And so you're trained in my tradition on how to make those priorities.
Yeah, and how, yes.
So progressive people within Orthodox circles, they get that. People who are more tribalistic, why are you wasting your time with these other people?
Yes.
So tribalism is a problem in every major religion, and I simply, that's just not part of my religiosity. For me, saving Syrian people from horror is the highest spiritual priority. I have no stake in it. There's no agenda, because that's the point. It's just a faith.
On a personal level, you just want to do this as a person. You decided that this is your
Because the divine
goal.
qualities are compassion, love, generosity, seeing the image of God in every human being, saving a life above all else. That's the religion. So I have no problems with combining that with my own personal Sabbath. I just have to go across enemy lines all the time that are divided by these tribalistic problems and by real concrete things that have not been worked out in terms of coexistence.
Yes.
So that's the odd combination.
How would you label this? So that's compassionate Judaism? Is it enlightened?
I just wrote a very
Yes.
thick book called Compassionate Judaism.
Yes.
And it's a scholarly book on a 19th century amazing rabbi from Italy. And it is a study of all of the Talmudic and biblical foundations of exactly that framing of Judaism with compassion at the core.
Yes.
Now, I know that most people don't live up to that. And I never expect states to live up to it, because states are only what we make of them. They're not to be worshipped. They're not to be idealized. They're just what we make of them. And sometimes they're horrible, sometimes they're great. And I don't confuse that with a religion. I don't confuse that with my spirituality. I just try to do positive work wherever I go. That's it.
I want to go to the other part that you also work on, which has to do with conflict resolution, and you picked few topics for this.
Right.
Obviously, Syria is one of them, Ireland, Bosnia,
Right.
but also the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Right.
And this is one of the core issue that we have in the Middle East today.
Right.
How do you view this conflict? What you've done on it? What type of work you've done on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
So for 32 years, since the early 1980s, I've been working to support peace builders in Palestine and in Israel, to support change makers. And in my opinion, when you're outside of a conflict, and since I am not an Israeli citizen, and I have no plans to be, and I'm not an Arab, and I'm not an Arab citizen, my job is merely to be supportive. And what I have found to be the strongest in terms of a social change agent is to be supportive of peace builders. Many people go in and they say, well, I figured out what the problem is, and I figured out this problem, and I figured out that, and I make recommendations. I kind of leave that up to other people, even though I've expressed support at various points for plans, and I have my own opinions about that. In the end of the day, in my field and also in my ethics, I've discovered that human relationships and building those relationships on an ethical core is the best way for people, enemies together, to figure out the next political space they need to be in. And that's all I could do, is that for 30 years I tried to support some wonderful Christian peacemakers in Palestine, some wonderful Muslim Sufi peacemakers. Occasionally I got involved in high politics when there were rabbis and imams that were actively involved with certain leaders in Palestine, and I tried to help in any way I could to build relationships across enemy lines, Palestine, Washington, D.C., and Israel. But mostly I focused on human skills and supporting and advocating for leaders who are cutting across enemy lines. And so even to this day, there are some key rabbis and Muslim leaders who, because of their communications, prevented riots, prevented things from getting into major wars in Israel-Palestine, moved towards ways in which we could pressure everyone to the table more by positive gestures that are shared by the different religious traditions. That's the best I could do. Ultimately, there are larger things in the Middle East that cannot change until there's more democracy across the region, until there is a greater building of trust with enough Jewish Israelis that they will pressure their government to change policies. So that there can be built a Palestinian state or a shared state between Jews and Arabs that will be democratic and equal. And that's what I've always said. All the years I was in Syria, I'm looking for equality and shared coexistence in either two states or one shared entity. It's going to be up to the people there. But the key is the values, the relationships of respect and love and trust, which is what we tried to model in our work.
But in terms of right now, there's talks about the deal of the century. We don't know anything about it yet. Yeah. But there's a plan that's being drafted, something that is supposedly to be more realistic than the other deals, something that is doable. Obviously, I would like to know how hopeful are you for such a deal? And at the same time, how could the Arab states not be involved if, for example, you have Iran keeps supporting Hamas and other terrorist organizations in the region, but also, the Saudi Arabia is a part of the Arab leadership that could basically also support the Palestinians to make this type of consensus with Israel.
The trouble is that one of the reasons why there's no Syrian democratic revolution and why the Syrian revolution was hijacked by a lot of terrorist groups is precisely because there's no major champions of Arab democracies in the Middle East. On the contrary, everybody was determined to destroy the Syrian Democrats. We have the same problem in Palestine. I mean, for all of these states to support Hamas and to basically kill the possibility of one unified Palestinian front was perhaps it was Sharon's dream, but it was also the dream of various states that don't want to see a democratic, free Palestine either. So we have to start facing that, that there are forces at work on all sides that don't want to see a democratic, unified, free Palestine. And that's part of the challenge here. So it is not just Netanyahu, it's not just the right wing in Israel, it's also the fact that it's very hard to find support for a unified democratic approach to Palestinian future. So that's why I'm saying that somehow both sides need to be bracketed from politicized religion, politicized identity, whether that's Christian evangelical or Islamic extremists or Jewish extremists. And if we could take that out and at the same time infuse it with positive values that could come from the religions, but not the tribalism from the religions. See, that's where we worked with all sorts of religious people that were truly committed to democracy on all sides. And then we were faced by tribalists on all sides that were determined to kill that vision. So the more that Arabs and Jews can work together on what those shared values are and commit to a democratic future, the more trust there will be to see that this happens. And that's when I think it can happen.
How hopeful are you to see this happening and manifesting?
Right.
Finding that peace.
Well, I
That
think
could change the world.
the evidence of history is going very much in the direction of democracy and human rights. It's been going in that direction for a few hundred years, but it massively accelerated in the last 50 years. So we're seeing so many more democracies and human rights institutions. We're building middle classes everywhere. Every year that I go back to Jerusalem, there are more young people at Hebrew University with hijabs. Some of the hijabs are combined with nice slacks. Some of them are much more full. But Hebrew University is the bastion of the Zionist education. And Bar Ilan, which is Orthodox Zionist, also has a large Arab population. So there is a fusion going on. And many people will resist that, just like in the United States, where the more that people are integrated, and the more that people of color and whites are coexisting, the more that some fight back against that in a violent way. And that's the same thing happening in the Middle East. The fact is that the democratic middle and the middle class are growing in Israel-Palestine. We need to find ways to support that so that they are the voters of the future, so that they have the money in the future to put together an economy that's going to coexist one with the other, instead of being win-lose, either or. Because the key problem in our field is a win-lose mentality.
Yes.
Tribalistic mentality, win-lose mentality. But the younger people, on average, are win-win mentality. They see the virtue of common businesses. They don't think people should be killing each other over religion. They think it's stupid. So the more that we can cultivate those kids and make an atmosphere everywhere else in the world, that is working. I mean, in Vietnam, this place of great extremism 40 years ago, and John McCain was a fighter, and he was dropping bombs. And they opened up a memorial for him at the Vietnamese embassy in Hanoi. All these people are coming and signing in memory of John McCain. Who would have thought? It's inconceivable, because he evolved. He went to Vietnam, and all these young people say, of course, good man. There's a lot of others that are still fighting here. Oh, in tribal, crazy ways over John McCain. And people are signing a memorial book in Hanoi for John McCain. So people are evolving around the world towards rational, democratic, middle-class, education-based life. And some of them still have spirituality. They have their own religions. That's what we're moving towards. So I'm very optimistic about the future. But there are always difficult spaces with deeply wounded people who persist in that for a very long time. And then others capitalize on it by selling them weapons and by encouraging their polarization. And that's always going to be the more unscrupulous underside. Same with Yemen and all of that. So you got to look at the positive, look at the numbers, keep remembering the numbers, and seeing things are basically going in a better direction.
My last question is about the minority of these groups that you were just mentioning, and how they would respond to somebody like you. You're basically trying to mediate and understand both sides, trying to bring both sides together.
Right.
Maybe to some Israelis, you're completely on the Palestinian side. To some
right.
Palestinians, you're a rabbi, you're Jewish, you could never be on their side.
Right.
So how do you respond to these people? And did you face a lot of that?
Yeah, it's kind of amusing. I mean, every time, like if I'll put a post on Facebook for the Rohingya, I'll get like 20 Muslim friend requests. Then I put something on about an amazing thing in Ethiopia that just happened, a peace treaty, and I'll get all these African requests. And then people will just drop off the moment I criticize something in their culture that is violent.
Yes.
So there's always going to be tribalists who only think of good and bad in terms of me and you, in terms of my tribe versus your tribe. If you say everything they want to hear about their tribe, they're with you. So that's what happens all the time. You know, they can't figure out, is he for the Jews, is he against the Jews? You know, when I'm a Sabbath observer, oh, I'm with the Jews, and they like the fact that I'm coming to synagogue. When I say something critical, oh, he's against the Jews. So this happens all the time, and we expect that in this work. And I have many, many Muslim and Christian colleagues who go through the same thing. Many diplomats who are basically secular go through the same thing. And we realize that this is a maturation process of the human species, that it's leadership. It requires mature, loving, compassionate leadership, and you have to just accept the fact that people are going to be angry at you. I've been really working on what are the triggers of getting people enraged, and trying to work on every word, and that's part of the books I'm writing, that every word has power. And if you're smart about it, you never say anything that can make somebody hate you. They may not agree with you, but if you really watch your words, you don't get hated.
Yes.
And it gets really tested. And I fully understand why the Syrian people totally lost it when it came to this war. I see why Americans are losing it when it comes to this administration. But on a day-to-day basis, the discipline of my mind, my heart, and my words being aligned, generally, I never get death threats. I never get what a lot of other people get. And I ask myself why, and it's because mostly what I write and do and speak about is visionary. Who's going to really hate me for working with Syrian kids? I don't know of a single extremist Jew who's going to hate me for doing that. Now, if I had my hands up together with somebody killing Jews, then yeah, they would say, you know, you're crazy. But if I just work with kids, and I care for those kids, and that's what my interest is, hardly anybody disagrees with that. So it makes you safer, which safety is another obligation of my spirituality and religion and ethics, and it also makes you more successful with winning people's hearts.
Especially in such a sensitive and complicated situation.
Yeah.
It's always great to have you. I've enjoyed this interview so much. Thank you so much,
You're welcome.
Dr. Gopin, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for sticking with us. Good night.